Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Sara Siegel, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and GrubStreet, I'm excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Sara Freeman discussing her debut novel, Tides. She is joined in conversation tonight by Emma Cline. This event is part of our New Voices in Fiction series sponsored by GrubStreet. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community, as well as our digital community. Every week, we're hosting events here on Zoom, and as always, our event schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk today, go to the Q&A button on your screen, and we will get through as many as time allows. You should also be able to access closed captioning by clicking the button on your screen as well. If you would like to buy a copy of Tides, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase it. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you for your support of community spaces like your local bookstore. Thank you also for tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support, now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Now, I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Sara Freeman is a Montreal-born writer currently based out of Boston. She graduated from Columbia University with an MFA in fiction in 2013. At Columbia, she won the Henfield Prize for the best piece of short fiction by a graduate student. Her work has previously been published in a number of literary magazines. She is joined tonight by Emma Cline, who's the author of The Girls and the winner of the Plimpton Prize. Her story collection, Daddy, was published in 2020. The Girls was an international bestseller and a finalist for a National Book Critics Circle Award, the first novel prize, and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and was the winner of the Shirley Jackson Award. Cline was named one of Granta's best young American novelists. Tonight, they're discussing Sara's debut novel, Tides. After a sudden, devastating loss, Mara flees her family and ends up adrift in a wealthy seaside town with a dead cell phone and barely any money. Mara detaches from the outside world and spends her days of self-imposed exile scrounging for food and swimming in the night ocean. As her money runs out and tourist season comes to a close, Mara finds a job at the local wine store. There, she meets the shop's owner, Simon. Confronted with the possibility of connection with Simon and the slow return of her desires, the reasons for her flight begin to emerge. Tides is a spare, visceral debut novel about the nature of selfhood, intimacy, and the private narratives that shape our lives. Without further ado, I will turn things over to our speakers. Sara, Emma, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you, Sara.
Hi, Sara.
Hi, Emma.
I'm so happy to be talking with you tonight about your really beautiful and wonderful book, Tides. And I thought maybe you could start with a reading.
I would love that.
Yeah.
I'm actually going to thank you, Emma, for being here, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I'm going to read. I'm going to read the beginning of the novel, which I actually haven't done yet, so I'm quite excited to do that. So you don't need to know anything about the book. On the long bus journey out, she doesn't cry or even have a single thought that she can name. She watches the dark impossibility of the road instead, the mostly empty seats ahead of her, the head of a woman a few rows up, listing forward and then jolting back. She does not sleep. She wants to be awake to make her declaration at the border. She will show her passport, and when they ask where to, she will say without hesitation, the sea. She does not have to leave. No one says you must go. No clothes thrown out the window. No eviction notice. Her husband is already gone by then. She was the one to tell him that he had to go. She could say it was the baby, her brother's and his wife's, his sweet squawking through the open window in the apartment beneath hers. She could no longer live in this fixed way, their joy so firmly lodged beneath her grief. She could say that. The motel advertises an ocean breeze, but is nowhere near the beach. She waits in the small room for something, for someone. She has turned her phone off, but she still feels it in her palm, waiting to bleat back to life. To deliver what message? I love you, I miss you, come back. She left a note for her brother and his wife. No explanation or apology. I'll be fine, that's what she wrote. She asks at the reception desk about another motel nearer the water this time. The woman behind the counter has eyebrows like tadpoles swimming lazily across her forehead. She says there is a town she might like, remote, for rich folks mostly, about 30 miles up the coast. There is a hostel there too. She puts her index finger on a map, her nail filed down to a tidy point. This one is canary yellow, the surrounding ones sky blue. She gets a ride from a man who is delivering ice across the state. His eyes are blue and inflamed, his hands raw and meaty. The town sign reads, "This road leads to Rome," with an ugly drawing of the Colosseum, followed by the population, 2,353. When she gets out in the town's central square, she touches the hard shell of the truck with gratitude, and it is so cold the hairs on her arm stand up. There is no Colosseum in this Rome. Instead, a supermarket, a Greek restaurant, an Italian restaurant, a seafood spot, an ice cream shop, a wine store, a laundromat, a pub, an inn, a garden center, a health center, a hardware store, a library, a clothing store, a pharmacy, a marina, and a dump. The sea in this new town is surprisingly hard to get to. It is somehow everywhere and nowhere. She needs an invitation, a private viewing, through the stately homes and onto the other side, where everything is vast and pristine. The other her, the one she left behind, would have easily slid between the giant piles, past the outdoor furniture, past the slim, lounging bodies and their purebred dogs. Everything belonged to her then. That was back when she believed that nothing that could so easily be had wasn't somehow already hers. From her bedroom window in the hostel, she can see it best, the sea and its expanse, edging in and then pulling back. She doesn't want to be in it yet. It is warm out, but she still feels frozen, bloodlet, fleshless. She is content for now to watch the comings and goings from afar.
Thank you. It's so fun to hear you read it just because the language is so lyrical and has such a propulsion, even as you're reading it. And then it's so nice to hear it out loud. I guess what I wanted to ask about first was where this book started for you. And if you could talk a little bit about that, whether it starts with form, just because the form of this book is so particular and is so tightly woven in with the book, or if it's story or character, or, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in some way, I think it started with both. I had this preoccupation with form because I had, as you know, tried to write another novel that really just, where I couldn't find a form to hold the story. And so I think as I, mourned that project and started this new book, I had this idea that I needed to find a form, whatever my new project was, that was just tight enough to hold this, whatever story I was going to write next. And so this was a preoccupation of mine. And at the same time, I also wanted to write a book. I had this idea that I wanted to write a book about adult siblings who are kind of enmeshed and are not really able to move on from their lives as children together. And so I started to write that story of these siblings in my usual formless way, in a pretty kind of like conversational mode. And once I got to the end of that draft, I realized that again, I had maybe made the same mistake as I had made before, where the form was formless. And in rewriting, I started to find, first of all, I just I realized I had only a few sentences that actually contained the sort of the feeling that I wanted in the book. And by following those sentences, which had a very particular cadence that was actually very unlike anything I'd written before, I was able to figure out where some kind of natural kind of end to these short chapters, paragraphs. And so in some way, the form was shaped out of this desire for more containment, but also the sentences themselves, which was something I'd never experienced before, all of it kind of coming together at the same time,
Yeah.
which was like such a relief because I had had such trouble doing that in the
I guess
past.
in that it kind of sounds like then the form came almost before the character here, or
Well, it's like I wrote the character in a shapeless way, in this way of like trying to figure her out, putting her in scene. And then I realized that I wanted that as I was rewriting, she sort of, I wouldn't say she moved to the backdrop, but I was following her through the sentences that were emerging, that were making this shape, and they were kind of coming together somehow,
yeah.
in an unusual, or what felt to me like a really miraculous way, because I had never experienced that before.
I guess it's like one of those things where, oh, like the first time you read Department of Speculation, you're kind of just like, why doesn't everyone write in a style like this? Like, it's amazing. I should be doing this. And I was thinking that when I was reading your book, just about how the like form is so deftly used, and you get to kind of, even though it has this very propulsive storyline, like it's moving forward inexorably, it also allows you to kind of have these digressions in this really like beautiful kind of poetic imagistic way, where you get to sort of drop out for a second to like build this really beautiful, even like something like her dreams, which again, like normally I think I would be like, dreams are so hard to pull off in a book, but the way that the form kind of is married to the content here, like the dreams work so beautifully. Like it's so, it's it's this really lovely collage.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm glad to hear that feeling that there's both tension and space, because that was I was worried about that. I didn't know if I could create tension while also having these like little morsels, these little I never thought of them as fragments, but they've been described now as fragments. So it's sort of like, but these little blocks of text, I didn't know that they could become this propulsive thing, which
Yeah, it's
I'm
funny
glad
how
that they did.
the blank space, I think, really lends itself to the sort of forward motion. And I've heard you say before that originally one idea you had was to kind of have a paragraph on each page, and to kind of have I mean, it made me think of like film editing, where they're kind of like, oh, the moment when you cut from one scene to another or one viewpoint to another should almost match the rate that people like blink. Like our brain likes those kinds of cuts. And something about the way you were describing it and my reading of it is like you almost switch fragments on the same beat of like a thought, which I think
Yeah.
is something, yeah, that you talked about before.
Yeah, I mean, I was very like where I ended, the beat was like very important to me, and I felt a little bit of a sense of loss that there wasn't the turning the page that happened anymore in this slightly new iteration with the paragraphs, because I really felt like it was these are these flashes of thoughts that this person is having, and God, who knows what is happening in between. That space is very mysterious and slightly terrifying, honestly, to me, for this character. So I hope that the little sliver of space still creates that.
Oh, I think it definitely does. And yeah, I was also thinking about this character who's like a cipher in so many ways, like so much about her is elided for the reader. But at the same time, reading the book, I never had the sense of like, oh, like she just always had the quality of life and kind of full on depth of a person, of a true character. And I'm wondering how you kind of make choices around what to include and what not when a character is in some ways hidden or not fully explicated.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I actually am really glad that you said that, because I think, you know, we often think like, oh, you don't want the character to be a cipher. You want the character, we want like full characters. And I'm hoping that what I was, you know, what I was balancing was, this is a character who I felt I knew quite fully, maybe because I had explored her in this other more kind of long form draft. I had put her in many scenes. I had written dozens of dreams of hers. I felt I knew her so intimately that the parts that I elided or removed of her were not because I didn't know her or because, you know, I wanted to be mysterious. I felt like they were the places where she might not know herself, the places where she was blocked because of, you know, a lot of grief that's taking place in her life at that moment. And also just, I don't know, the way we are with ourselves, like the sort of, in some ways, I kind of wanted it to have the feeling of a self-portrait, but like kind of like a negative space self-portrait, so that the absence is the thing creating her outline. But I think it's important that I had this feeling of her presence all the time, her mood, how she was feeling, what state she was in, and all of this information I had kind of like discovered about her, if that makes sense.
No, I mean, it's so wild to just think about sort of writing this character so intensely for another project. And I think there's like a tendency, if you can't, you know, I feel this way, like if I've written a story and it just doesn't work, to be like, oh, this is wasted work, or I've wasted time or something like that. But to kind of trust that these things show up in other ways, that like writing, especially something like a novel, which I think does like draw so much on your like subconscious, or like what's in your subconscious, like what's stocking the pond of your brain. It's cool to hear and like remember that that work like ends up somewhere.
Totally. And I think it's really, really challenging to keep, especially as someone who had never done it. I mean, you know this, right? As someone who's never done it before, the first time you do it, you have to believe that it is going to amount to something, even if you're writing it and you're like, this is trash. This is a wasted scene. I actually don't think there's no such thing. Like, I feel like some kind of intimacy gets built between you and these interior worlds, and then you use them, if you stick with the character. I don't imagine that this will be like my exact technique every time, because there was a lot on the cutting room floor, and I think I'd like to use more of the material that I write in the future. But
I guess I also just like so many, in a way, there's so many balls in the air. I think when you're working on such a like tightly constructed scale, in the way, like in these, I don't think they're fragments, but in these little sections, it just is all very artful and all kind of needs to click together in a certain way. So I was like so amazed at sort of how you did it. And one of the things I wanted to like hear more about was basically how you decided to handle time. Because I mean, how long is it? What time period does the book span? Like, is it
like I would say like less than a year,
Right.
maybe late summer to, I think, spring.
I think it was just so interesting to kind of see like what moments we like settled into, and then sort of in certain places, you know, like weeks would pass.
Mm.
And it was just interesting. I wanted to hear kind of what those choices were like for you.
Yeah, I mean, I knew pretty early when I was in this kind of second draft and discovered the shape, that given my kind of fixation with this character's sort of circular, her habits, basically her repetitions, I sort of knew that I wanted it to end and begin in a similar place, to have a kind of shape like a circle. And that was very helpful because I think it created, it wasn't exactly a time pressure, but it created some kind of tension rod. And then I think the seasons gave it that slightly more fluid feeling of like a change, but over a medium, like a kind of medium scale. And then I don't know, actually, like from scene to scene and the white space, it's true. Sometimes you're like, days have gone by. And that was again a bit of a challenge because often it meant just removing a scene or adding a scene. I did a lot of, once I'd written the whole draft, I did a lot of kind of, you know, if I put the paragraph here, if I put this page here, how does it create tension or dissolve the tension? And so I also felt somehow that the whole thing was suspended, that she was suspended, and that if I like moved one piece, she might drop. And somehow that had to do with the way time worked in the narrative, although I'm not doing a great job of describing how.
It makes total sense to me. And I think that's part of what I was like, so why I was interested in it, because it is such a like high wire act almost.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that I think is functioning at the level of time that's very important is that I had a lot more of the past at one point in this book. And I think because of the sort of homogeneity of the parts, the past and the present are kind of on the same, they have the same weight. And so I felt I had to be careful, very careful about where the past emerged and how frequently it emerged, because it was like a little, actually someone described it as like, it's a little psychological endorphin hit when the past comes back, because it feels quite full. But I felt it could also break the tension of the present, in which not very much happens. But anyway, so all of these pieces were kind of had their own logic, but I sort of was inventing it as I went along and revising a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know you and I have like talked a lot about like scenes and like either the desire to do scenes or like the desire to totally avoid them. And just reading this, like even though there are scenes or moments that I think of as scene-like, in which like obviously things are happening and there's dialogue even, there's still this like valence of, okay, we're in her like worldview. Like the scene is almost like through like many layers of glass or something, which I think is like works so well. And I was just wondering kind of like what you gain by not having, like what you get to do when you don't have to have like scenes in the same way. I mean, the thing that I'm thinking of that I saw that you got to do was kind of these like digressions and kind of build more of almost like what our internal lives actually look like to ourselves, which is like, you know, we don't experience our life in scenes that just like move steadily forward, like in our like the past and present get very like murky, you know. I don't know, I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, I think I'm not sure. I really want to know how to write a really amazing scene. But I think part of it was that I felt I didn't know how to do the things that I was supposed to know how to do. And so I had to do the things I knew how to do, which was another kind of observation, another kind of infusing description with interiority, and kind of thinking of, I suppose it's that, is that my logic was a very interior logic. And I think scenes have this like, that's why the dream is the MFA. You're not allowed. You can't have the dream because the dream is the scene inside. You're not allowed to do that.
Yeah. I think that makes total sense. That's what I was thinking of too. It's like what a book looks like if the like emotional and internal is the like engine, which I think is closer to how we like live our lives.
It's interesting because I also felt that she doesn't have that much, she actually doesn't have that much in-depth moment of like exposition type interiority. But it's like every element is about herself reflected out.
Yeah. And like all the things, I mean, I was thinking that too when you were reading the opening, and there's just kind of a list of the things that are in the town, and how in a book like this, like the objects become like almost a way to like echolocate herself, you know, and also the other like characters too. Just like it's all this world that you as the writer have built, and we get to see the character, you know, based on how she's responding to this constellation of like nouns almost, or like words that you choose. I guess like one other question that I had that I was also really curious about, because I'm always like, how do people deal with like modernity and the like embarrassing stuff of our lives? And it's so funny, like this book is obviously like set in the present, and there's phones and porn and things that I think of as like very much like the embarrassing stuff of the world. But at the same time, there's like almost a timelessness about the book. And I said this to you, that it almost reminded me of like John Berger, where there's something a little bit out of time or eternal about it. And I wondered like how you decided to like drop in the modern world, or like how you were going to frame it, if that makes sense as a question.
Yeah, it does. And I think, you know, you're saying these are the modernity is like embarrassing. I mean, I think you're someone who manages those elements like really beautifully in your work. But I feel like I knew that I couldn't avoid the fact that she has a phone and that she has the internet, and because that's ridiculous. But I also was interested in a slightly more existential type character who isn't just a series of objects that are also potentially status symbols and an extension of her identity. So yeah, I mean, I definitely had a few readers who were like, she's got to turn on the phone at some point. And so, you know, the phone was turned on again because of someone saying, you can't forget that this is reality. So toggling, I think, between this like sense that this was like a fable, but also that it couldn't be unreal, was another kind of balancing act. Who knows if I struck it? I mean, I think.
Oh, I think totally. And hearing you say fable is also so interesting to me, because it did have that quality. And yeah, what is it? It is kind of like this timelessness, like slight heightened quality, where things are like not symbols, but the objects take on this like meaning that they don't, you know, in another kind of book.
Yeah.
I guess I was also thinking about the book being so much about like liminality and sort of in between spaces, and sort of that as a theme that I saw recurring, and whether you had like any thoughts on that.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I definitely think that first of all, the setting really helps with that feeling, because she arrives and the place is alive and it's, a seaside town in full bloom, although she doesn't, it's all reflected through her. So it already feels a little bit dead. But then I think the town itself is sort of in this liminal limbo state, waiting for its next season, for most of the book. And so I think that feeling, which many of us probably have experienced, just going to a place that has a different life in a different season, can feel. So that was, I think that sort of sets the stage for that liminal feeling that you're describing. And then it's true, she lives, above the wine store. She's kind of slinking around the periphery of the town. And I guess I was interested in someone who is sort of not quite in her life, and who maybe is resting after like a period of a lot of difficulty, but also maybe has never really been like her life's protagonist, and who hasn't quite like made the step to live her life. So yeah, I do think I do think she's, and I think the white space probably contributes to that feeling too, of like all this time, this liminal time that we don't have access to, in her. So yeah, I do think it was on my mind, not consciously, but there for sure.
And I guess that kind of leads into my next question, which is like, I'm always so interested in how people choose like a title of a book, and sort of how you came to this, as like, were there other iterations of it, or like what sort of made you land on this, or like what does it mean? What does it mean?
What does it mean? I really was hoping you wouldn't ask me that, Emma. What do the tides mean? No, actually I had another title, which I think we've talked about this a lot, how many humiliations there are in writing. I think I had another title, and maybe like someone who read the draft and read the title was like, what's this title? My title was The Lining. So I had this whole idea that which I think is a very nice title, by the way. Not right, it wouldn't look as beautiful on this amazing cover, but I had this idea, which is something we were talking about earlier, that the book was going to be the sort of description of the interior landscape of this character. And I was thinking of a kind of like the frayed lining of a coat. And there was at some point like a coat that had a frayed lining. Anyway, it was a little bit elaborate. So I think with Tides, again, this is something that emerged pretty naturally as I started to find the setting, the character, the sort of feelings of the feeling of push and pull, of memory and of thought, and of just habit of mind. And obviously it felt right. And the sea was already taken. So like, I feel I actually do feel like that is truly the best title.
Is.
It really is.
What a bitch.
Yeah, Iris Murdoch's terrible person. Apparently she baked a lot. So, she wasn't that bad. Yeah.
I guess on that note, Iris Murdoch and things like that, sort of, do you think of it as having like DNA, like artistic DNA in other writers or poets or art, or I think that's kind of an interesting way, like, because most writers I talk to do have like very
totally, and in a way that's usually much less direct than, it's like, I think a lot of people have said, oh, this is like department of speculation because of the shape. but I would not at all consider that part of the DNA. It wasn't on my mind as I was writing. In fact, after I wrote this, I remember reading Department of Speculation, not for the first time, and thinking, oh my God, has a lot of similarities in the form. Is this a problem? But it was like the opposite of DNA in some way, I think.
Yeah.
But no, I had these, I think these women leaving books and movies that were on my mind, like Vagabond by Agnes Varda, even Wendy and Lucy, a Kelly Reichardt movie. And then for some reason, Ann Tyler's Ladder of Years, I've just like returned to over and over, even though the writing is actually pretty conventional, but this idea of a woman leaving just kind of stayed with me. And I think alongside the women leaving DNA is the women in rooms DNA, in these kinds of, I'm thinking of To Room 19, the story by Doris Lessing, which again, I just continued to return to. What else? What other rooms? I feel like I used to read this story as a child, like maybe 8 or 9, Anastasia Krupnik, like pretty like, did you like that? She's like in her room in this tower and she's alone and she's brooding. I feel like that kind of made its way in. And actually another movie I was thinking about recently, I don't know if you've seen this Georgian movie, Happy Family, which is also about a woman who leaves this sort of quite middle-class life and a real sort of family, like a real family scene to live on her own in this apartment. And every single object that she acquires in this new apartment is just like this liberation for her. And it's just so gorgeous. And then I guess, finally, I was thinking the other day that, in some way, as I think actually you gave this book to me. I must have read this like 5 or 6 years ago. It was Days of Abandonment, the Elena Ferrante, which I think that's like where I learned some of this like emotional urgency. She's not disintegrating quite as much, my protagonist, but I think reading Elena Ferrante's early work was pretty crucial, and feeling like I had some permission to write a really interior character.
Yeah. When you were talking about sort of women who run away from their lives, and then this like, I guess, what is Anastasia Krupnik? Is it YA? Is it a children's book?
Yeah, it's maybe even middle grade, I think. Middle grade.
I was thinking about that's some of the pleasures of a book like yours, is that it's like, it hits that feeling of like, oh, you get to watch this character kind of run away with nothing and then like make a little home like out of nothing, in a way that it reminds me of like the Boxcar Children, or like things like that, where there's something about somebody kind of who has like a safety net of sorts, but like the idea of what would life look like if you had to make it kind of out of thin air. And the way that objects become really important in the way you're saying, and how you make this little space, and the fantasy of like getting to create a life like adjacent to your actual life. And, like,
I think it's always been something that I've not necessarily personally fantasized about, but I enjoy reading and watching, and think is also kind of impossible at the same time. Like, I think it's very difficult to disappear. Especially, I think it's especially with technology, like I think it's a place that we can explore in fiction maybe more than in reality.
Yeah, totally. I don't know. I just love this book so much, as you know. Do you feel like there's anything that you want to talk about the like writing of it, or?
No, I feel like we touched upon the thing that I've been reflecting on the most, which is how much work is work that feels like it's lost, but that is crucial to the process of finding the final shape. And I guess I want to say that to anyone who is working on a project and doesn't feel like they will ever find a shape for it, is that, you know, it's so iterative, you know, it's so repetitive. But I think once you find it, it's so satisfying. I don't know. I mean, does that resonate with you in terms of drafts?
Oh, definitely. And I think like, yeah, I've sent you such like messy version that in some ways bear no relation to what the book ends up being, but you almost need people to tell you like continue on, like keep going. Um, and I feel like a book is basically doesn't feel like a book for the majority of making it
Hmm.
until right at the very last minute where you're like, oh, something this time for whatever has like clicked in and it has the like, you know, whatever the aura of a book is, it finally has it. And it's a little mysterious, like why or how you got there.
Yeah. Oh, that I actually, that's quite comforting to hear it said that way, that it doesn't feel like a book until the very end. And in some ways it's true. As I begin to work on something new, I'm just reminded how bad it is at the beginning, you know, how unformed it is, or how like homeless it is, you know, it has no, yeah, it has no center of gravity. So
Yeah. I
yeah.
feel like we talked about that a lot before, that just like writing, because it comes totally from you, and exists kind of on a Word document, that only you have created. You know, you don't get any of the momentum that you kind of get in other art forms from the materials, you know, like I'm painting on a canvas, like this is a
Right.
thing, or like this is a movie where like 45 people are helping me create this like thing. It's just your like thoughts in your like words, and
I know.
so much of it just seems like working past the embarrassment, just the like inherent embarrassment. I don't know, but I'm really glad you did.
Thank you. I'm glad you continue to as well. Um, maybe we should move to questions.
um oh,
Hi, sorry.
Hi, Sarah.
Yes, so we have a handful of questions here. This first one you did touch on in a sense when Emma asked about DNA. Somebody asked, in writing with such a lyrical style, were there any specific works, either prose or poetry, that you took inspiration from in their language?
You know, one person I didn't mention, maybe because she was so in the DNA as I was writing, was Rachel Cusk. You know, I don't think of her work as lyrical at all, but something about, I found her language when I encountered it. I actually think, Emma, you might have recommended Outline to me again. Thank you. Um, I found something about the precision of her language so moving. I mean, I don't think it's what people say about her work, that it's moving, that it's like, um, that it's poetically rich. It's very precise, but I guess that precision was something that I had in mind and wanted to emulate. In the end, I have my own style and it ended up being different, but she was certainly one of the major influences that I didn't mention.
Kind of related to this, and you did discuss several films. Somebody asked, do you have a screenwriting background that impacts your writing? And or do you see the scenes visually while you're writing them?
I do not have a screenwriting background, but I do love film, and I watch a lot of movies, or did actually more before the pandemic when I went to the movie theater a lot. Um, but I think in this particular book, I was thinking very visually, and the objects, the world building was very important, but kind of as you were describing it, Emma, more these abstracted objects that were kind of word objects, if that makes sense. So yeah, for this project, I do think I was imagining this place in a very visual way.
Shifting gears a little bit, somebody asked, how did you know when to end your book? When did you feel like you had a finished product? Did you know early on how you were going to end the book?
So I think at one point, maybe halfway through the kind of rewrite, this sort of radical rewrite that I did have a sense that it was going to end where it, with this scene, if it doesn't give very much away, but there's a sort of repetition in the end. I knew what would happen, and so yeah, that did create a little bit of containment. So I knew before I finished writing it what would happen at the end. Yeah.
This question's kind of funny just because of the way this book came about, that you had this sort of second iteration of it. But is there anything you would go back and change if you could?
You know, sometimes I wonder, I don't know if you're supposed to like admit this, but sometimes I wonder, so much of the process of this was removal of material. And and that was part of the editing process, but it was also part of my own self-editing process. And I wonder what it would be like to have given myself a little bit more permission to let more of the material come up to the surface. I don't know. I actually think about this all the time, and I don't know. I don't know if I regret it or not. I think it is what it is now. Yeah, it's on my mind. It's a good question.
Did anything surprise you while you were writing or editing?
Yeah, I mean, I actually found that the language was the language was surprising. It was not the voice that I always had, and that I found something as I was writing in a way that I hadn't before. Um, yeah, so something about the tone and the sound was surprising.
To hop back just a second, you mentioned that a lot of the process was removal. How did you decide what to keep and what was removed?
Just a lot of anxiety, a lot of like a lot of anxiety about, I would remove something and then I would think like I removed too much. It's too much, and then I would return to it and sort of um, put it back in, put it in a different place. Um, just a lot of trial and error, and holding, this quite small narrative always in my mind and knowing where every piece was and what it would mean to remove. So yeah, anxiety, a lot of anxiety and pleasure, I guess. There was a pleasure.
These next two questions are more about content. I
Right.
loved the artfulness of your book, but I found the reading experience almost gut-wrenching. The characters are just not very likable people, quite defective, actually. Can you please comment on this?
Yeah, that was also something that was certainly on my mind, that I was not judging the characters as I was writing them. I did wonder if at some point, if Mara was a likable character, but I felt I knew her so well and had kind of spent enough time with her that I just I had to do her psychology justice. I wasn't going to make her more likable than she was in life. And I was interested in someone who pushed boundaries and who wasn't always doing the things that other people wanted her to do. That was certainly part of my interest in working on this character.
Thank you, Sarah, for the incredible reading. I'm curious about desire in your book, perhaps particularly its relationship to absence, to lack, to loss, to want. It's been said that desire is a want of being whereby a human becomes themselves. This seems very relevant to Mara, but also insufficiently embodied. Can you tell us a bit about desire and tides, how it works for the book and for you as a writer? And I can
So
repeat that if it was a lot.
I know I can see it. I'm reading it. Maybe Emma, do you want to answer? No, I'm just joking. Desire is a want of being whereby a human becomes themselves. Yeah, I mean, it's so much what we talk about, right, in writing fiction. What does the character want? And I remember always thinking, oh, I have no idea what I want. How could my character possibly know what they want? And so I think it was certainly a force in this character, something that is always like lighting her up, but I don't think I always knew exactly what she wanted. That said, I think she's also in a period in her life where she loses her desire and she doesn't yet know how to reclaim it without making the same mistakes she's made again. It seems like desire is the thing that has gotten her in trouble over and over again. So it lives in this kind of pretty fraught space for her, I think. Yeah. It's a big one. That's a big one. I'm going to keep thinking about that.
Mara is an outsider and in such a state of transition. How did you write her character so convincingly?
Do I think of myself as an outsider? I think I have had a lot of experiences of being in transitional places, moving, not feeling quite inside. And so I suppose I probably tapped into that feeling of being on the outside, looking in. And then also just interacting with other people who'd have had those kinds of experiences and being kind of awake to those.
I heard use of the future tense in the novel opening that you read. Did you write in that tense naturally? Do you use that tense throughout? Do you attribute some of the book's propulsive force to that grammar?
Yeah, I actually think it's funny. I don't think of it as the future tense. I think of it just as I guess it's like the present continuous, the present tense. But yeah, I think it does the third person present. I think someone told me you shouldn't write in the third person present tense. They were like, it's impossible. She's doing things as she's moving. But I think it does create that sense of pull towards the future. I didn't have it like that always. It was in the first person in my first draft, and it was in the, I think it was the first person present tense, and then in rewriting, trying to kind of like create this atmosphere that I had encountered in the first draft, that was what emerged, and it does stay that way throughout.
Our last question, and I think we might have time for another if anybody wants to put anything else in the Q&A. Sarah, while you are writing, do you read in the space, related or adjacent work for inspiration and clarity, or do you try to remain free of direct, immediate influence?
Yeah, I don't read very much while I'm writing because I'm a bit of while I'm in the very, very intensive parts of writing, because I find I am pretty influenced. Does that, yeah. Emma, what about you? I'm curious about you.
I think sometimes like nonfiction kind of scratches the itch for your brain to be busy elsewhere, but it's not, it can feel, you have better, like, you're not as porous to like language or things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't read something that I really, really love while I'm in a crucial part of generating material. I think that would be somewhat dangerous in terms of taking it on. But then, of course, afterwards I'm reading all the time. But
What about movies?
yeah, I don't think that's, I definitely, I think that's safe. That's safe contraband.
All right, well, we are just about wrapped up. Sarah or Emma, if you have anything else to add.
Sorry, I'm just seeing about modernism.
Yeah, there was
Certainly.
one more question. Were you inspired by any?
Yeah, but again, in that kind of DNA way, I think that Emma, you're talking about, like, definitely the waves. Um, I mean, definitely Virginia Woolf somewhere in there, but not like not so much at the surface.
Yeah, I think you and I have talked before about how so much of writing a book comes from the like subconscious place, and sort of after the fact, you can kind of try to piece together how it happened, but so much of it is sort of beyond your like knowing.
Yeah, I do think, I think that's very much the case.
Thank you so much to Sarah and Emma for your time
Thank you.
discussing Sarah's beautiful debut novel. Thank you all for tuning in and showing up for authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and our incredible staff at Harvard Bookstore. There is a link in the chat to purchase the Tides if you would like to support Sarah and the bookstore. Thank you all so much and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much, Emma.
Of course.
Such a pleasure. Thank you, audience. You were great.